Hi, it's Dr. Crone. Welcome to the first video in our unit on democracy. In this video, we're going to examine the concept of democracy. We'll look at types of democracies, and we'll also look at how political scientists measure democracy. Comparative political scientists identify two different types of governments, democratic and authoritarian. So in this unit, we're going to focus on democratic regimes. In this picture, I've got that represented by India on the left as an example. And I've also got the definition here of democracy, rule by the people, or sometimes it can be thought of as government by the people. That word comes from Greek roots. So I put the literal Greek roots there, demos, which means people, and kratia, which means rule by or government by. And the reason that comes from a Greek root is because most historians credit the birthplace of democracy as ancient Greece. Although it's possible that there are other societies that we could think of as democratic in prehistory and in past history, but at least Western style democracy really came from roots that were from back in ancient Greece. So in our next unit, we'll look at the other type of government, which is the authoritarian. And here I've got that represented by a picture from China. There are many authoritarian regimes all around the world. So here we see the two basic types of regimes. And what I'd like you to do before we move on to the next slide is just pause the video for a minute and list out some of the differences that you see or that you can think of between democratic and authoritarian governments, just off the top of your head, with knowing what you know now, which may not be very much. Basically, how would you tell whether a country was a democracy or not? What features do you think a democracy needs to have in order to qualify as a democracy? So go ahead and pause the video and just list a few of those down, because we're going to compare your list to the list that political scientists make in just a minute. Okay, let's compare your list with what political scientists agree needs to be present in order to call a regime a democracy. So the first section is that citizens have political rights, and political rights means the right to participate in the political system. So universal adult suffrage. Suffrage just means the right to vote, and universal means it applies to every adult citizen. So there's no discrepancies in law about who is allowed to vote. So this would mean men and women, all genders, all religions, etc. Free and fair elections. So making sure that not only is there an election, because most countries hold elections, even authoritarian countries, most of them hold elections, but is it free? Is there free competition in the election between political parties? Are the elections fair? Are they rigged in some way? That's what we mean by those political rights. So a second section of what we need to have to call something a democracy has to deal with how accessible is the government to citizens. So in other words, not only can you vote, but you have access to government and government officials if you need to talk to them or find out what they're doing. So the first one would be that government actions are transparent. In other words, if you want to know what happened at the city council meeting, you can ask for their minutes and they will give you that. Or you can, perhaps they cover them with video. There aren't secret meetings. The government isn't doing things in secret. The military is subject to civilian control. That's one of the most important and often not valued by citizens, I guess. One of the most important requirements for democracy is that the military listens to the elected leaders and is subject to elected leaders rather than being able to take over themselves, because many countries that have these that have authoritarian rule have a military that basically is calling the shots. And then another important thing for a democracy is to have an independent judiciary. In other words, the judicial branch is separate and not beholden to other parts of the government. So, for example, when you are arrested by the executive branch, by the law enforcement personnel, you are judged by someone different than that, not by the people who arrested you. That's what we mean by an independent judiciary. And then finally, that the citizens have civil liberties. So these are things like freedom of speech, freedom to petition the government, freedom of assembly, those kind of things that in the United States we have quantified in our First Amendment. Another really important piece of democracy is a free press, so not controlled by the government. One thing that you might want to post for your discussion board this week is a few things from your initial list before we got to this slide, and then how those initial thoughts compare with this list. Did you think of things that weren't on this list? Did you compare things that, or did you miss things? And talk about how your thinking has changed or what's happened in your learning from thinking this through. One thing I want to point out is not on this list that's really important is that there's nothing on this list about separation of powers, like that we have to have the president or the executive branch and Congress be separate, like they are in the United States. There's nothing in here about checks and balances either. And when we study legislatures and executives, you're going to get a fuller understanding of how we could have a society without separate legislative and executive branch that would still quantify as being a democracy. And in fact, the majority of democracies do not have separation of powers the way that the United States does. So all democracies share the requirements that we listed on that previous slide, but there are differences among democracies. And here we're going to look at a couple of structural differences. Later in our course, particularly in the unit on legislatures and executives, we're going to dive a lot deeper into the differences among democracies and how the kinds of things we can compare within free democracies. But here we're just going to look at some structural differences. So the first main kind of typology of different types of democracy is direct democracy versus representative democracy. And this might be something you're already familiar with. So direct democracy is a situation where people vote directly on laws. Whereas in a representative democracy, the voters elect the people to represent them, and it's the representatives who actually make the laws. Oftentimes we see this as a black and white distinction, like a country can either be a direct democracy or a representative democracy, but that isn't really how things are. Often there's kind of a myth that direct democracy doesn't exist except for back in ancient Greek times, and it's not practical today. So all democracy or all democratic stuff is representative in the modern world. But that is not true at all. That is not true. It's not even close to capturing the reality of democracy today. And in fact, the amount of direct democracy is increasing in the last 30 to 40 years. So it's true that today there are no countries that only have direct democracy for lawmaking. But direct democracy exists today in many countries in many forms. And in the United States, for example, there's no direct democracy at the national level. All of our laws at the national level are made only by representatives in the legislature. But almost all United States states and localities allow some form of direct democracy. So if you're a US voter or you're about to be a US voter, if you've ever voted for or against a tax levy, then you've participated in direct democracy, which we do those all the time, right? Even if you are not of voting age yet, if you went to public school, you've probably heard about your school district's tax levies, and those are times when the voters in Ohio, voters are required to vote. The school district cannot levy taxes on citizens without asking permission from them. And so all of that is direct democracy. We had an example almost every year in Ohio. We have some kind of referendum on the ballot where Ohio citizens get to vote on a proposed law. They're not always very well publicized, but a couple of years ago, in 2015, we had a referendum on whether to legalize recreational marijuana, and it failed. And yes, I included a picture here because the campaign did have a mascot, and his name was Bud. So that's kind of silly. Switzerland allows national direct democracy to amend its constitution, as do a number of other countries in Europe. And a Swiss example from 2009, 57.5% of Swiss voters approved an amendment to their constitution to ban new construction of Islamic minarets. And minarets are towers which are generally built on top of or adjacent to mosques. So this is a form of religious architecture in the Islamic faith. And so Switzerland banned new construction of minarets, and that's part of their constitution. Some countries like Britain have what are called non-binding direct democracy at the national level. So in Britain, there was a national election, what was called a non-binding referendum, to exit the European Union, to remove Britain from the membership in the European Union's economic cooperative group. And of course, many of you have heard of Brexit, and that was a positive referendum. It was a fairly large majority voted in favor of that. Now, that didn't make it into a law, but it really, in many ways, had the force of forcing the British Parliament to go along with it, because not to go along with that would mean that they were deliberately going against the official will of the people as registered by voters. So, so direct democracy is alive and well, and don't ever be convinced that it's not. So when we look at representative democracies, which is what most democratic countries have for the majority of their laws, are representative democracies. But within that, there's also two types. And so we can have what's called a constitutional republic. The United States is a constitutional republic, so is France, so are many of the European countries. And a constitutional republic basically means there's a constitution and there is no monarch. There's no hereditary leader of the country at all. It is a non-monarchical, usually non-religious based country. On the other hand, you can have a constitutional monarchy. So a constitutional monarchy means that, yes, there is a hereditary monarch, a king or a queen, who inherits the throne, but that person does not have any power, and rather they are limited by a constitution to a certain role, usually a very small and kind of official role. You might even call it window dressing or a picturesque role, not at all a lawmaking type of role. So Britain was the first constitutional monarchy in the world. It became a constitutional monarchy in the late 1600s. By a series of laws that were passed by Parliament, it's essentially taking away the king's power. So Britain, yes, Britain has a queen. She has some official roles in the in Britain's government, like she, quote, opens and closes the parliamentary sessions. In other words, when they convene in the fall and when they go home for the Christmas break and things like that, the Queen opens Parliament and closes Parliament every year. However, she doesn't have any choice in the matter about that, and she doesn't have any power over Parliament. If they chose to not have the Queen do that, they wouldn't have to. It's done by tradition, and it's mostly a formal, celebratory kind of a role. So what I want you to know, first of all, about England is to get rid of any misconceptions you have about what happened during the Revolutionary War. By the time the U.S. fought the British for independence, Britain was a democracy. It was a complete democracy. It was a parliament. Not a lot of people had the right to vote, but then again, neither did they in the United States when we first became a country. So Britain was a full-fledged democracy. The king had no power, and so don't ever let anybody tell you that the Revolutionary War, we were fighting to throw off an authoritarian king and we didn't want to be ruled by a king. I was taught that in elementary school. I don't know if they still teach that, but it's a miscomprehension of it. Basically, what we did as the United States, our revolution threw off a representative democracy that wouldn't allow the colonists to be represented. And we wanted to create our own democracy, just like England's, which we pretty much did. So from the time England becomes a constitutional monarchy in the 1700s, up until now, the vast majority of monarchies in the world have become officially constitutional monarchies. There are only a very few authoritarian monarchies left. Probably the most famous of them is Saudi Arabia, but there really are not that many. Just for fun, and you can pause here if you want to read this, this is a list of constitutional monarchies that exist in the world today. You can see a lot of them are in Europe. And then what's called the Commonwealth countries are all former British colonies that still sort of keep the tradition of the Queen being their official quote-unquote monarch, just as she is in Britain, where she doesn't have any power, but for example, the Queen comes to Canada or to New Zealand and calls upon the people and has state visits and things like that, but it's not in any way powerful. So if we think back to our list of requirements for a democracy, most of them are things that could be present in differing degrees in different countries. So yes, we can divide countries into sort of democratic versus not democratic, but really it's more like a continuum. For example, some countries might have free elections, but they might have strict limits on civil liberties, or things like that. So comparative political scientists really think of democracy as a continuum. And in order to sort of operationalize that idea, they've made a lot of efforts to create measurements that sort of capture the idea of what is democracy and how can we tell when one country is, quote, more democratic than another. So these measures, there are tons of different measures, and they all have their own issues. The goal of any measure of democracy is to find a way to quantify how democratic a country is, something that we probably have a generally understanding idea of, but it's hard to say how would we measure that. So these are organizations that have created these sort of index measures to try to figure out how should we measure this. And they're all based on the basic characteristics of a democracy we already went over on slide 3. These are all calculated by apolitical or non-political international organizations, meaning that supposedly they don't have any skin in the game in terms of saying one country is better than another. So they're independent international organizations. But for sure it can be challenging, and different rankings, different measurements capture different sort of aspects of democracy. So for example, the Freedom House measure, which we will use because it's really easy to use, but that measure tends to really be a little bit heavier on civil liberties and a little less heavy on sort of the institutional parts of democracy. Whereas if you look at the polity measure instead, that's more about, are there democratic institutions? They do still measure civil liberties, but not quite at the same level. So, and these measures can actually be sort of consequential for countries. There are organizations like, sort of international charitable organizations that only give grants to countries that have above a certain ranking on one of these measures, and so it can really have consequences like which measure they use. So that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of controversy of that at kind of the international public policy level. But for our purposes, we're going to use Freedom House. We're going to use it for one of our country assignments, and we're also going to use it in just half a second here. I like Freedom House. It's as good as any of the others. It has its weaknesses, but they're not terrible. It's standardized so we can compare countries really easily, which is sort of the whole point of having a measure like this. And the website is simple and actually kind of fun to use. So I hope you enjoy. So I just want to present here, this is one of my little charts where we look at a measure. So these are scores from Freedom House as their 2020 measures. So on the left, well, after the country names, we have the country name. Then on the left, the freedom score is a score out of 100 of how free that country is. And the scores would run theoretically from 0 to 100. And that's broken down into two sections. Political rights, these are things like how free and fair are the elections? Are political parties free to organize? Can all candidates get onto a ballot? Is it impossible for rival candidates to get on ballots? Things like that. The things that have to do with the actual electoral system and the political system too, in terms of the judiciary or the other institutions of government. And then civil liberties, which here is 60% of the Freedom House score, is just what it sounds like: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, how are minorities treated in the country, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual orientation, things like that. How is that treated in the country? And Freedom House breaks down their categorization finally into three sections, three statuses. There are free countries, partly free countries, and not free countries, and that has to do with the score, the raw freedom score that they get. So you can see lots of things here, and I hope you pause the video a little bit and really take this in. One thing you could post on the discussion board are things like, are you surprised that the US is significantly lower score than the United Kingdom or Germany? Does that surprise you? That hasn't always been the case. In the last 4 years or so, 5 years, the United States has dropped considerably. If you want to know why that is, you can read more in your textbook and then also on that Freedom House report. It's obvious that a country like China, -1 on political rights, so it's obvious they're rejecting the democratic idea. You might want to speculate on the discussion board about why you think that's so. Why you think Russia, which used to be up in the 70s and 80s, is now at a 20. And then, we keep looking at Nigeria and lots of examples for Nigeria. And here we see Nigeria is ranked as partly free, despite all the problems we saw with its capacity and corruption and other things. Does that give you any hope? What we talked about in the first week, hope about Nigeria increasing its capacity. Does this give you any hope for that? So now what you're going to do is do some research. Hopefully this is getting a little familiar now. This is 3 weeks in a row we've been doing this. So it's your turn to do some research on the website. And I'm going to read this and then I'll go on to some slides that show you what the website will look like. So you're going to access freedomhouse.org and get your country's report. And then you're going to want to record the 3 scores that we just saw on the chart that I just showed you. So the aggregate score, the political rights, and the civil liberties scores. And you should post your scores to the discussion board for this week, and feel free to discuss your reactions to those and your reactions to each other's, maybe compare and contrast that a little bit when you're responding to somebody. Hopefully we'll all learn something about the countries we're studying here. Okay, so let me show you a little bit about what this website's going to look like when you get there. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see that's the URL for it is freedomhouse.org. And as soon as that pulls up, you'll need to scroll down about halfway down the website. You're going to see this Explore Democracy and Net Freedom Around the World, and there's a colorful map. Just click on Explore the Map, and that's going to open up the section that we will be working with. Okay, and then once you click on the map, you're going to see a global map where you can see every country. Find your country on the map. This is going to be good practice for you because if you're going to be studying a country, we want you to be able to find out where it is geographically. So as usual, I'm using the Brazil example here. So click on it and that'll sort of zoom into the part of the world that your country's in. And it's also going to open up a little box with all the information that you need for this particular week. So it'll show you that, that composite score in the top right, and then the breakdown of political rights and civil liberties. So that's the information you need for your discussion board. If you want to, you can just screenshot it and put the screenshot right in your discussion board. Also, feel free to play around on the map if you want to compare and contrast. You'll see that the map is very colorful. So free countries are green. Partly free countries are gold, and not free countries are purple. And just for a little bit of a preview, if you click the bottom part of the box that says View Report, that will get you the information you're going to need in, I believe it's 2 weeks from this week, but it depends on, yeah. It's going to be when we study authoritarianism, you'll have another country assignment where you will be using your Freedom House report to as a source, basically. So that's where that's going to come from. But for now, all you really need is that call out box there. If you have any trouble finding this or you want any help with it, please let me know and I'm happy to do that. So here's a parting fodder for our discussion board. You know, thinking about democracy, you have a case study to read in the textbook called Is American Democracy in Trouble? And this is something that a lot of pundits and political scientists have looked at. The Freedom House score for the United States has dropped since about 2014. It has dropped for various reasons. So if you want to know more about that, you can always read the country report for the United States from Freedom House using the way I told you to get to the view report in the previous slide. But definitely read that textbook case study and then think about posting something to it about it on the discussion board. What do you think? Do you think American democracy is in trouble or not? There's actually good evidence kind of on both sides in that reading. Okay, that's all I've got for this video. Be sure to post your Freedom House scores. Make sure that you do that because otherwise you'll lose some points on the discussion board. And be sure to watch the second video in the unit before you do that post. Have a great week.